To note, in 1898 there was no standardized building codes. Those wouldn't begin to be established for another 17 years. The actual recommendations that would lead to those building codes wouldn't be made for another 7 years. And although municipalities had some forms of building codes at this time, Park City was not among them. There were no federal building codes, and those that existed were established to prevent only the most egregious of hazards. The first available fire retardant devices were invented by George William Manby, a British inventor who devised a method of pressurizing a copper cylinder which could then be loaded with potassium carbonate, a primitive form of foaming agent, and these extinguishers, they were bulky and expensive and only held about 3 gallons of material. They also weren't really used in the United States. The United States wouldn't see commercially available fire extinguishers until soda acid extinguishers came to the States in 1881. And just to mention, these fire extinguishers are not really comparable to what we have today. They look similar, but the operation is a bit different. One would take the extinguisher, turn it upside down, and grab the apparatus by the handle at the bottom of the unit. When held inversely like this, a small store of sulfuric acid that was held in the bottom of the tank would then be introduced into a much larger store of dry sodium bicarbonate, aka baking soda, thus recreating the same reaction one would see in a standard second-grade science fair volcano project. So for as clever as the device is, when fully operable, it still only results in a small stream of retardant liquid being expelled from the hose, similar to what one might see from a dollar store squirt gun. Also, because of the limited size of the area in which Park City is located, houses and businesses were packed very tightly. And because this was a mining town, these buildings were built cheaply, quickly, and solely out of locally available wood, ponderosa pine specifically. And they didn't have flame-retardant building materials back then. Asbestos wouldn't become standard use for another several years at this point, and the area, the simple fact that they are nestled in a canyon, means that when a fire starts, it spreads quickly. And when winds come, fires will make the winds worse, and the winds, in turn, will make the fire worse. And then there's the business. Park City was a mining town, and mining is hot and dangerous work. Mines and fires have been chummy friends for all of industrialized history, after all, and Utah alone had seen several mining encampments burn down over the last few decades. Silver Reef, Shawnee, Newhouse, Frisco, all mining towns, all had seen devastating fires, and this was something Park City knew all too well. The fiery furnace, as it was so commonly called in the papers at the time, was not the first fire Park City had seen. In 1882, just 2 years before, after the town's founding, a fire started at a mining camp had carried into the town proper, destroying several buildings within its path. And a short 3 years later, in 1885, another fire would erupt, claiming only one building this time and causing mostly localized damage. This, of course, is the difference for Park City on a calm day versus a day with a mild breeze, as the 1898 fire would be a massive devastation. Estimated at costing over $1 million at the time, it would garner national news. It would become a front-page story in many publications. The Park Record would report of the incident. Hundreds of men and women worked with desperation to save their belongings, but nearly everything that was taken into the street was quickly consumed in the fierce heat and blaze that was driven through the town with an intensity that resembled the flame from the end of a blowpipe. The Desert News would report the following day, "It may be that the city will be rebuilt and rise again from the ruins that now cover the canyon where it once stood, but it will be years before it can fully recover, if recovery is possible at all under the circumstances. From the terrible visitation, the loss, it is conservatively estimated, will aggregate more than $1 million. The actual insurance will not reach more than a tenth that amount. Park City would be rebuilt, reestablishing the town and rehousing most of the residents within only a year and a half. The relationship with mining, however, and the peril so fraught with it, would not recover so kindly. The town would again suffer tragedy only a few short years later, when a store of dynamite, housed underground, within a mine, would explode, causing a cave-in that would claim the lives of 34 miners. Silver prices were also starting to fall around this time, taking a deep nosedive. These circumstances, all held together, would see an end to Park City's days as a mining town. The population diminished, and with it, many businesses could no longer sustain themselves, and for several decades, Park City would remain a tiny mountain village of little repute and little importance. I've been researching mazes and labyrinths a lot for this episode. I don't think there's any surprise there. And there was one thing that really stood out to me while doing my research. One thing that really made me question my preconceived notions about how those two things exist in our world. What surprised me so much, and what left me with this sort of je ne sais quoi feeling, was the building materials that mazes and labyrinths are built out of. And not just the materials, but within the use of materials, there's almost a certain motif embedded with such a consistency. I think when I first started, my expectation was to find these large mazes made out of concrete and stone that I had never heard of or seen before. And I thought I would be so excited to bring these all to you. But, as I'm sure you're aware at this point in my monologue, that was not the case. Surprisingly, the world is almost completely vacant of any structures made out of mortar and stone that could be called mazes. There's really just a few concrete mazes, and they're tiny, little tiny 3 to 8 turn mazes. They're small, generally on private land, and I might be a little bit generous with what I actually allow to be called a maze here, as a few of these are really just entrances to the homes of eccentrics. And as far as actual mazes, one can go visit and explore and try and solve. The materials out of which they're constructed are never so permanent. Primarily, you'll find mazes which are constructed out of hedges or corn. Yeah, that's right. Almost all of the world's mazes, possibly in excess of 90%, really depending on how small of mazes you're willing to count, are constructed out of temporary agricultural products like corn, or ornamental hedges, or common buxix boxwoods, or used or monetary cypresses. The few remaining mazes are built out of either sheets or posts, as in the case of the Wonder Maze, the world's largest indoor maze in Dubai, or wood. And most of the wooden ones are simply built out of pallets, with a few remaining being built with slightly nicer constructions. And although they tend to be large, they always are lacking foundations. They are themselves remarkably temporary structures, establishments which could be demolished, removed, with the site cleaned by the end of the day, and you would have never known they were there. Mining towns, you see, much like mazes, are temporary things that only exist as long as we maintain them. They will not bear the brunt of time, nor the callous indifference of man's disregard, and left to their means they will fall away. The boxwoods will die, the corn will form no lines, the pallets and wooden walls will fall to the wind, and lying there they will rot in the rain. Within a few short decades there will be no trace of them at all. And I tell you about the beautiful buxus boxwoods hedge mazes in England, or the staggering beauty of the Monterey cypress maze in Australia, or the sheer scale of the Samso labyrinth maze in Thur the Forest of Denmark, or the vast variety, yearly redesigns, and the quantity of corn mazes America has to offer. But what quiets me is the fact that speaking to you now, there is no guarantee that any of these mazes exist in the future. If you happen to follow the S-Town podcast back in the day and watch what happened to John B. McLemore's hedge maze, then you'll know what I'm talking about. It only takes a few years, 1 or 2 really, in the heat, to kill off a hedge maze entirely. These plants, they just can't make it without that extra water. They need it. Without care, a hedge maze falls back to nature quickly. Wooden mazes, they're a little more hardy. But regardless, if you follow the blogs of these owners of wooden mazes, you will find that winds blow them down and break them and beat them. I've always been a little fascinated with mazes personally. I was glad to find a couple, like the Hookatown Maze in Oklahoma, or the Great Maze of Puzzling World in Wanaka, New Zealand. But even wooden mazes, as I've said, lack foundations, and are so easily lost to time. I imagine the business of running a maze is not a terribly easy one. It's a sort of weird business model, and there's no real guidebook to the expense-profit ratio within giant wooden mazes. I told you I came into this with a sort of expectation that the world had many, many mazes for our delight. But the sad truth is my perception was probably tainted by a trip to Rapid City, South Dakota when I was younger. There are a lot of things the Badlands has to offer. There's amazing scenery, old historic trails, epic rock climbing. But what I really remember from the Badlands is the Black Hills Maze. It was a large wooden maze, roughly 12,000 square feet, big enough that you could see its 4 prominent towers from miles away, with a large simple ramp that fanned out into 2 offshoots with movable walls, all so that the maze could be redesigned every few weeks to keep guests coming back. And although it's not the biggest wooden maze in the world, the 12,000 square feet had stood in size between the Great Maze at Puzzling World in Wanaka, New Zealand, and the behemoth-sized maze of Hoagatown in Broken Bow, Oklahoma, which itself stands at outstanding 40,000 square feet, almost an acre. I keep talking about the Black Hills Maze in the past tense because, sadly, it is no more. It's another casualty of the virus, I suppose. The maze couldn't survive the pandemic. Because mazes, like I said, are remarkably temporary structures. I was one of the many people devastated to find out that this maze had closed. The posts on their Facebook page are honestly heart-wrenching. That's really because of the amount of heart and effort that this family put into their maze. It showed in a lot of ways. In reading the posts, you see a story that kind of starts to emerge, with this family who keeps up with not just their employees, but many of their guests. A family that fights and struggles against the elements, rebuilding the maze as the snow and wind try to reclaim it from them. A family that would run this maze through generations and watch their guests likewise grow, seeing kids become parents, following the academics of guests, learning about what they were doing in school and congratulating them on music recitals and graduations. Several people who had worked there commented on how great of a place it was to work, how it was the best job ever. There was a remarkable amount of effort that was put in there. This maze would see scout groups and school classes and birthday parties, and they often went out of their way to make the experience something truly special, like opening up the maze to a group of 14 10-year-olds and letting them run around playing Nerf wars, or handing out flashlights on Friday nights and letting people run the maze in the dark, or letting moms in for free on Mother's Day, or supporting the local school, or the orchestra, the choir, the local youth activity groups. The Black Hills Maze was kind of an institute. It was a destination. It was a part of the heart of Rapid City. Sadly, their parting words truly show us how temporary a maze really is. As their Facebook page tells us, the Black Hills Maze has been sold to a development group, but they do not plan to reopen as a family recreation attraction. Thank you for the last 20 years. Because what do you do when you can't do business, you know? The Black Hills Maze had no way of making money during the pandemic, and much like Park City, who at the time we left them off in the 1920s had no way of making money either. Like everyone, they faced the woes of the Great Depression, but being a silver mining community, they were one of the areas most directly affected. You see, between March of 1919 and February of 1921, silver prices would fall from $19.55 an ounce to $9.77 an ounce. A drop of just over 50%, and with it the idea that silver was a legitimate metal of monetary standards comparable to other mainstays like gold, that idea would come into serious question. Over the next 10 years, the price of silver would continue to fall, reaching unthinkably low levels until the price would finally bottom out in January of 1931 at the remarkably low price, 29 cents an ounce, and this trepidatious fall in silver prices would spell an almost complete end to all of Park City's silver mines. It wouldn't be until post-World War II when extremely skilled, military-trained ski troops of American GIs returning from the war, still looking to show off their skiing skills, but with notably less focus on avoiding Nazi gunfire and with more focus on general winter fun, would begin to promote the sport of skiing, and with this change, a new economic opportunity for Park City would truly begin to emerge. They were no slowpokes when it came to jumping on this new emerging fad either. The miners of the United Park City Mines banded together to create a land development proposal for the land, owned by the collective and conveniently accessed via Main Street. Opening with what was at the time the longest gondola in the world, the resort was dubbed Treasure Mountain. Skiing would breathe a new life into Park City as other resorts would open in suit, turning the once beguiled town into a premier skiing destination, and although it had a slightly shorter season than some other destinations in Utah, Park City would be noted for remarkably easy, quick access to its resorts as well as its abundant trails and slopes. The Treasure Mountain Resort would lead the way for the Park City Mountain Resort, Canyons Village, the Deer Valley Resort, Woodward, the Utah Olympic Park, among others, and Park City would begin to flourish once again. A city of only 8,000 residents, Park City would find further fame and become a city of note for this particular podcast, as it would steal the Sundance Film Festival from Salt Lake in 1980, holding Sundance's